Call came at 2047 in the morning. Not a knock, not a doorbell. The kind of pounding that means something is already over before you understand what's happening. I was 63 years old. I had worked for the same company for 31 years. I had never been inside a police station except once, in 1987, when I reported a stolen bicycle. I mention that because I want you to understand what kind of man was lying in that bed when the pounding started. My wife was already awake. That was the first thing I didn't register until much later. She was sitting up. Not startled. Sitting up, like she had been waiting. I got to the door in my undershirt and sleep pants. 2 officers. One had his hand already resting on his belt. The other one held a piece of paper out toward me and said my name, the way people say names when they already know the answer. Bernard Kowalski. I said yes. Step outside, sir. I asked what this was about. The one with the papers said they had a warrant. The other one, younger, maybe 26, 27, moved slightly to the left of me in a way that was not accidental. I stepped outside onto the concrete in my bare feet. It was November. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. My neighbor across the street had his porch light on. I don't know if he turned it on when he heard the noise or if it had been on all night, but I remember seeing it. That yellow light. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hoped he wasn't watching. They cuffed my hands behind my back. My wife came to the doorway. She was wearing her robe, the dark green one I had given her for our anniversary 4 years ago. She had her phone in her hand, and she was filming. Not crying, not asking questions, not saying my name. Filming. I looked at her, and I could not make my face do anything. I just looked, and she looked back at me over the phone screen, and then she looked back down at the screen. The younger officer guided me by the arm toward the patrol car. I asked again what the charges were. He said the detective at the station would explain everything. The door closed. I want to tell you what it feels like to ride in the back of a police car with your hands behind you, in your sleep clothes, at 3 in the morning, when you have no idea what you have done. There is a particular kind of silence that comes with that. Not peaceful silence that comes with that. The silence of a phone that has stopped ringing and you don't know if someone answered or if they hung up. I had been married for 26 years. The station was 40 minutes away. No one spoke to me during the drive. I watched the highway lights pass overhead through the window, and I thought about my son. He lived in Portland now. He would be asleep. I thought about whether someone would call him. I thought about what he would think when he found out. I had a daughter too. She was 24, lived about 15 minutes from us. Close enough that she came for Sunday dinners most weeks. Close enough that the thought of her finding out this way made my chest feel like something inside it had collapsed. They put me in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a paper cup of water. My hands were still cuffed, in front now at least, which they had switched in the parking lot. I wrapped my fingers around the paper cup and I drank. There was a mirror on the wall. I looked at myself in it for a long time. I was 63 years old and I was sitting in a police interrogation room and I had no idea why. The door opened at 4:22. I know the exact time because there was a clock on the wall and I had been staring at it. The man who came in was somewhere in his mid-50s, not a uniform, plain clothes. Dark slacks, grey shirt, a jacket that looked like it had been through a lot of winters. He sat down across from me and put a folder on the table. He introduced himself as Detective Aldrich. He did not open the folder right away. He looked at me for a moment. Not the way the officers outside had looked at me, not assessing a threat. More like he was reading something. "Mr. Kowalski," he said, "before I go through this, I want to ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer them honestly, even if you think the answer doesn't help you. Especially then." I told him I had nothing to hide. He asked how long I had worked at Hartwell Industries. 31 years, I said. He asked what my position was. Senior Procurement Director, I said. I oversaw vendor contracts, bulk purchasing agreements, all external supply relationships for the manufacturing division. He wrote something down. He asked if I was familiar with a company called Crestfield Logistics. I said yes. They were one of our secondary freight vendors. We had used them for about 4 years. Nothing major. Overflow capacity, some regional routes. He asked if I had personally approved the contract renewal with Crestfield last March. I said yes, standard renewal. The terms were the same as the prior year. I remembered it because it was a small contract and I'd almost handed it off to someone else, but it came through at a busy time and I just processed it myself. He wrote something else down. Then he opened the folder. He looked at the first page, then the second. He turned to the third page and he stopped. He was still for a moment. Not long, maybe 5 seconds, but it was the kind of stillness that changes the temperature of a room. He stood up. He looked at me again. And whatever he had been reading when he looked at me the first time, this was different. Something had shifted in his face. Not softness exactly. More like the expression of a man who has just found something he was not expecting and is now recalibrating everything. He walked to the door, opened it, and spoke to someone in the hallway. I couldn't make out the words. Then he came back in and sat down. "Mr. Kowalski," he said, "I owe you an apology for how this morning started." I stared at him. "The complaint filed against you was submitted by your wife 2 days ago. It alleges that you have been diverting company funds through fraudulent vendor contracts, specifically through Crestfield Logistics, over a period of approximately 18 months. The reported amount is just over $400,000. The number hit me like a physical thing. I did not divert anything, I said. And even as I said it, I understood, in the way you understand something before you fully understand it, that this was not actually about me at all. Detective Aldrich looked at the folder again. "The account listed as the destination for these alleged transfers," he said slowly, "is registered to a Bernard A. Kowalski. Your middle initial is what?" "James," I said. "Bernard James Kowalski." He nodded once. "The account belongs to a Bernard Allen Kowalski. Different social security number. Address in Tempe, Arizona." He paused. "We ran it when we processed the warrant. It came back flagged. The Bernard Kowalski in Tempe has an existing federal fraud case. He is currently under investigation by the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit." He looked at me directly. "You are not him, and whoever filed this complaint either did not know that or did not care." I don't remember exactly what I said next. I think I didn't say anything. I think I just sat there and felt the room rearrange itself around me. He told me they would be uncuffing me. He said I was not under arrest. He said he needed to ask me some more questions, different questions now, and that I was free to have an attorney present if I wanted one. I told him I would answer whatever he needed. I want to tell you about my wife, because you need to understand who she was, or who I thought she was, before I can explain what came next. Her name was Lorraine. We met when I was 34 and she was 31 at a work event that neither of us had wanted to attend. She was an accountant then, working for a small firm downtown. Sharp, funny, the kind of person who could hold an entire room without raising her voice. I fell in love with her over the course of about 45 minutes, and I never fully recovered. We built something together. A house in suburban Ohio that we spent 15 years making into a home. 2 kids. A dog named after a baseball player. Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper spread across the kitchen table. I trusted her with everything. That is not an exaggeration. I trusted her with my financial passwords, my medical decisions, my fears at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I trusted her the way you trust a load-bearing wall. Not because you've thought carefully about it, but because you have never once had a reason not to. What Detective Aldrich told me over the next 2 hours dismantled all of it. Lorraine had left her accounting firm 6 years ago to consult independently. I had supported that decision completely. It was what she wanted. It gave her flexibility, and she seemed happier. What I did not know was that approximately 3 years ago, she had quietly begun working with a man named Alan Kowalski, not as a client, but as a partner. Alan Kowalski was not a difficult man to find, as it turned out, once you started looking. He had a history of financial schemes, nothing that had stuck until now. He moved around, changed his approach, found people on the inside of large companies who had access to procurement systems and the authority to approve contracts. He had found Lorraine. I don't know exactly when it started. I don't know what he promised her or what he told her about me. I don't know if she went to him or he came to her. Those answers would come later, some of them anyway. And even now, I'm not sure I have all of them. What I know is that she had given him information about Crestfield, about our contract structure, about the renewal process. What I know is that funds had been moving through a shadow account she had helped set up, through Crestfield's billing system, in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags, over 18 months. And when the internal audit at Hartwell triggered a review in October, she had filed a complaint against me before anyone could look at her. She had used my name, my position, my 31 years at that company, and she had aimed it all at me like a weapon. She had done it 2 days before the warrant. She had done it knowing I would be taken out of the house in the middle of the night, and she had stood in the doorway and filmed it. Detective Aldrich asked me if I had any documents at home, personal financial records, anything related to Crestfield, emails. I told him I had records of every contract approval I had signed, going back years, stored on a personal hard drive in my home office. I always kept copies. It was a habit I'd developed early in my career and never abandoned. He asked if I could give them consent to retrieve it. I said yes. I gave them the exact location. I told them where the spare key to the office cabinet was. He also asked me, carefully, watching my face when he asked, whether my wife had access to my work email. I thought about it. About 8 months ago, I had asked her to help me draft a response to a vendor dispute. It was a complicated situation, a lot of back and forth, and she had always been better at that kind of clinical written communication than I was. I had given her my password so she could pull up the original correspondence. I had never changed it afterward. I sat with that for a moment. I told him yes. He wrote it down. I was driven home just after 8 in the morning, not in a patrol car, a detective's unmarked vehicle. One of Aldrich's colleagues, a woman named Rivera, drove me. She did not make conversation, and I was grateful for that. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Same shutters, same oak tree in the front yard that needed trimming. Same mailbox with the small dent in the side where I had backed into it 3 years ago and kept meaning to fix. My wife's car was not in the driveway. I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the room I had eaten breakfast in for 22 years, and I did not make any coffee. I just sat there. My daughter called at 8:45. I don't know how she found out. I learned later that a neighbor had texted her early that morning. She was at my door in 18 minutes. I heard her car before I saw her. She came in and she sat down across from me, and she put both her hands on mine and she didn't say anything for a while. She just sat there. That is the thing I remember most clearly from that entire day. Not the interrogation room, not the handcuffs. My daughter sitting across from me at that kitchen table and not letting go. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The hard drive contained everything. Time-stamped contract approvals, correspondence, my full access log showing every time I had entered the procurement system, and from which IP address. None of the flag transactions corresponded to my login. They corresponded to a login using my credentials from an IP address registered to Lorraine's home office computer. The Crestfield account had been set up through a web of shell structures, but it wasn't complex enough to survive serious forensic accounting. The transfers were real. The account in Alan Kowalski's name had received the money. And Lorraine's fingerprints, not literally but financially, were everywhere. The FBI was already building a case against Alan Kowalski. This connected directly to it. Lorraine was arrested 11 days after I was. I was not home when it happened. My daughter had convinced me to stay with her for a while, and I had agreed, mostly because I could not figure out how to be in that house by myself. I heard about it the next morning from Detective Aldrich, who called me personally. He told me the charges included wire fraud, conspiracy, and filing a false police report. He said the DA's office was taking it seriously. He also said something else. He said that in 22 years of doing this job, he had not often seen a case where the evidence trail was so clean on one side and so damning on the other. He said that whoever had helped set this up had clearly underestimated how thorough a 31-year procurement director's record-keeping habits would be. I thanked him. He said he was sorry for how the morning had started. I told him he had done his job exactly right in that I didn't hold it against him. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. I don't need to describe all of it. There are parts I won't describe, not because they're too painful, but because some things belong only to the people who live them. What I will tell you is that I learned things about the last 3 years of my marriage that I am still honestly working through. Some of them surprised me. Some of them, when I look back, I wonder if some part of me already knew, the way you sometimes know a sound is wrong before you can identify what made it. I learned that loneliness is not the same as being alone. I had been lonely inside my marriage for longer than I had admitted to myself, not because Lorraine had stopped caring, or maybe she had, and I had talked myself out of seeing it. But there was a distance that had grown between us that I had kept trying to attribute to stress, to age, to the ordinary wear of a long marriage. It wasn't ordinary wear. My son came from Portland when he heard everything. He stayed for 2 weeks. He helped me sort through what needed to be sorted through, and he came with me to my first meeting with the employment attorney who was handling my situation with Hartwell. The company had placed me on administrative leave when the complaint was filed. Once the investigation cleared me, they offered reinstatement. I declined. 31 years is a long time to give to a place, and I had given it honestly, but I was 63 years old and I was standing at a door I had not expected to reach. And when I looked through it, what I saw was not more of the same. I retired, formally, with a full pension and the handshakes and the cake in the break room, which my daughter attended and which made her cry, which in turn made several of my colleagues cry, which I found both embarrassing and genuinely moving. I have been asked more than once by people who know what happened whether I hate her. I have thought about that question more carefully than I have thought about most questions in my life. I don't hate her. I don't know if that is wisdom or just exhaustion. And I am not always sure it matters which. What I feel most often is a kind of sadness that has no clean edges. Sadness for the years that were real. And some of them were real. I am certain of that. Sadness for the version of us that existed before whatever happened. Sadness for my children, who lost the family they thought they had and are still, each in their own way, figuring out what to do with that loss. I feel anger sometimes. I won't pretend I don't. There are moments, usually at night, when I think about standing in the cold in my sleep clothes with my hands behind my back, and I feel something hot and dark that I do not dignify by calling it anything other than what it is. But I have learned, and this is the thing I most want to say to anyone who has been through something like this, that you cannot rebuild anything while you are still burning. I live differently now. I moved to a smaller house in a quieter town. I have a dog, a ridiculous affectionate golden retriever named after no one in particular, who gets me up at 6 every morning and considers this a great personal favor to both of us. I have dinner with my daughter on Sundays. My son calls twice a week, sometimes 3 times. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, doing financial reviews for small non-profits that can't afford professional accounting. It is not glamorous work. It is exactly the kind of work that I find, at 64, more meaningful than anything I spent 31 years doing for a corporation. Last spring, I was having coffee on my back porch when my phone showed a news notification. Alan Kowalski had been convicted on 7 counts of wire fraud. The sentencing was 12 to 15 years. Lorraine had accepted a plea agreement the previous fall, reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Alan. She received 36 months of probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent bar from any financial services work. I read the notification once. I put my phone face down on the table. I watched my dog investigate something in the corner of the yard with the focused intensity he brings to everything. I finished my coffee. There is a version of this story where I tell you I felt nothing reading that. There is another version where I tell you I felt satisfied. Neither would be exactly true. What I felt was something quieter than both of those things. Not closure. I don't think that word means what people want it to mean. More like the moment when a sound you have gotten used to finally stops, and you realize how long it had been there. I have been asked what advice I would give to someone in my position. To anyone sitting in that kind of silence, at that kind of table, trying to understand how they got there. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure clean answers are honest. But I will tell you what I know. I know that 31 years of keeping careful records saved me. I know that telling the truth, even when it was painful, gave the investigation something to work with. I know that the people who showed up, my daughter at my kitchen table, my son on the first flight out of Portland, the detective who made a phone call the next morning that he did not have to make, those people were already there. I had just not needed them in that way before. And I know that the most dangerous betrayal is not the dramatic one. It is not the 2:47 a.m. knock, and the handcuffs and the cold concrete. Those are just the moment you find out. The dangerous betrayal is the slow one, the one that happens in the ordinary rooms of an ordinary life, quietly over years, in the space between what someone says and what is actually true. That is the one you don't see coming. That is the one you survive anyway. I have thought a lot about what actually saved me that morning. And it wasn't luck. It wasn't the right words at the right moment, or some sudden burst of courage under pressure. It was 31 years of doing the ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping my records clean. Every approval logged, every contract time-stamped, every decision traceable back to exactly who made it and when and why. I had done that not because I suspected anyone, not because I was protecting myself from something I could see coming. I did it because that is what you do when you take your work seriously. That habit, built over decades without any particular drama attached to it, was the only thing standing between me and a fraud conviction I did not earn. There is something in that worth sitting with. The choices that protect you are almost never the ones you make in a crisis. They are the ones you made on an ordinary Tuesday, years before the crisis arrived, when no one was watching and nothing was at stake, and you did the right thing anyway simply because it was the right thing. Lorraine made a different kind of choice, not once but many times over many months, in small increments that probably felt manageable in the moment. I don't know what she told herself. I don't know what Alan Kowalski told her, or what she believed about where it was all going, but I know that the path she chose required her to keep making it smaller. The truth, her judgment, her sense of what she actually owed the people around her, until there was almost nothing left of it. And then one night she stood in our driveway in the dark and filmed her husband being walked out in handcuffs. And I think some part of her must have known, even then, that you cannot hollow something out that completely and still call it a life. That is not judgment. That is just what I have observed about how things actually work over 63 years of paying attention. What I know about resilience, and I am careful about that word because it gets used too easily, is that it is not a feeling. It is not something you summon when things fall apart. It is what is left when everything else has been stripped away, and you find out what you are actually made of underneath. The morning my daughter sat across from me at that kitchen table and held my hands, I was not resilient. I was barely holding together, but I was still there. I was still telling the truth. I was still, in spite of everything, the same man who had shown up honestly to his life for 6 decades. That continuity, that refusal to become someone smaller than who I had been, that is what I mean when I use the word. I retired. I moved. I got a dog. These are not dramatic acts of recovery. They're just what came next, one day at a time, when I decided that what had been done to me did not get to define what came after. I think about Bernard Allen Kowalski in Tempe, Arizona, the man whose name was used to build this entire thing. And I think about how we were both, in different ways, collateral damage in someone else's scheme. And I think about Detective Aldrich, who took 5 extra seconds to read carefully before acting, and how those 5 seconds mattered more than almost anything else in this story. Pay attention. Keep your records. Tell the truth, even when it costs you something. Show up for the people who need you, the way my daughter showed up for me. That is all I know. It turns out it was enough.